All right, good evening, everyone. Do not adjust your sets. I'm sitting in as acting mayor. Mayor Brown is in Vancouver, but is going to be joining us through Zoom. I'd like to start the meeting by saying that we are honored to gather here on the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation, and I would like to open the regular council meeting agenda. Can I get move the agenda?
Move approval of the agenda.
Second.
All in favor? So moved. The minutes are next.
I'll move the minutes both from the regular meeting July 10th and the committee meetings, the Homelessness and Affordable meeting from June 19th and the Advisory Planning Commission from July 13th.
Second.
Second.
All in favor? Thank you. No delegations. Correspondence. Vancouver Island Oban Cemetery Services, Roger Kishi, resident. Is Roger here? No.
You want me to speak to that?
Yes, Mayor Brown.
So Roger is our connection with the Oban tour. He facilitates their sort of program while they're in the village. And traditionally we have supplied an amount of money so that they have a dinner together. And that's his request. And that's why it's here. It's August 11th and 12th, I think, are the dates this year.
Fantastic. Council? It's a recommendation there.
I'd like to move that council allocate $200 to the Oban Cemetery Tour for the Oban tour donations in 2022 and direct staff to include a $500 budget allocation in future years to support the Oban Cemetery Tour.
Second.
All in favor? Passed. Okay. Reports. Tree Protection Bylaw Recommendations Report. Prepared by Karen Albert, Senior Planner. Oh, and there is Courtney.
Okay, good evening, Council. Karen is just on her way over, so I can do, but this report does not need much presentation from staff because we're going to turn it over to our consultant, Camille, to give a presentation and walk you through it.
Fantastic, thank you. Hello, Camille.
Oh,
We can't hear you
Think
yet.
you're on mute, perhaps?
no.
No? We're having some audio issues. Please stand by.
I think it might be on her
I
side.
think it's on her end.
Oh,
Yeah.
There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Hello,
Yeah.
Camille. Yes, we got
Okay,
you.
great. Well, so much for testing it earlier. Just allow me 1 second here to share my screen and we should be ready to go just shortly. Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, Council Mayor. Great to be with you this evening again. My name is Camille Lefrançois. I'm the Environmental Planning Manager with Diamond Head Consulting and also project lead on the scope of work, developing a tree protection bylaw for the Village of Cumberland. As was mentioned, I'll be giving you a brief presentation this evening to just give you an outline of the report that was submitted as part of the agenda package. And we'll be keeping the presentation brief so that we have plenty of time to take your questions and hear your comments later on. If you have any issues hearing me at any point, just interrupt me and let me know.
Great, thanks.
Excellent. So just briefly, the presentation, I will bring a brief reminder of project context and scope, and then I will provide an overview of the recommendations that are made in the report that was attached to your agenda package, including a reminder, a briefing on some of the objectives and engagement findings, and then focus on those recommendations related to values and community context, as well administrative and best practices recommendations. And then I'll just be briefly concluding with some remarks on anticipated financial implications of this new tree protection bylaw. So briefly, just a reminder in terms of context, I wanted to remind everyone in attendance that we are beginning this project with some input from other existing policy documents at the village, including your official community plan, which has several objectives relevant to environmental protection and tree protection in particular, as well as a number of recommendations that were included in your urban forest management plan, many of them specific to a tree protection bylaw, as well as generally supporting the canopy cover targets and other goals of this plan. As you may recall, we are doing this project in 3 phases of work. We have been working on the background review and recommendations the last few months, and then we'll be heading into bylaw drafting and adoptions later on. As you may recall, we last met with this council in March of this year at the Committee of the Whole meeting, where we provided an overview of the project. Since then, we have been working on a review of existing information and community context, as well as carrying out some community engagement. We had a number of opportunities for input for your community, including some online meeting where we had 7 participants attend, and a survey that was taken by 93 respondents, and also conducted a presentation to the Advisory Planning Commission. So all of this information has been brought together in the report that was provided to you, and we are here to hear your comments and feedback, and hopefully get an endorsement or direction on the recommendations so that we can move into bylaw drafting in the coming weeks and months, with the hope of bringing a draft bylaw to you for consideration this fall. So as mentioned, I'm going to provide a very brief overview of those recommendations, and we'll be happy to speak in more detail to any of them as we get to the period after this presentation. I wanted to bring a reminder to this council of some of the objectives for the value-informed components of this bylaw that we have talked about the last time I met with you. You may recall that I brought a few big components that we should consider when thinking about the components of your bylaw that should be focused on your community context and value, including, of course, urban forest protection, which is an important reason why communities decide to adopt tree protection bylaw, and help us decide the level of protection, tree retention and replacement that is desirable in your context. We also want to make sure that we are considering the implementation resources that this bylaw is going to require, which is something that I'll be speaking to more later on in the presentation, and you have also more information about that in the report. And then finally, we also want to balance out the implications for your private property owners. A tree bylaw that is going very far at the tree protection element might have fairly big impacts on the ability for your property owners to manage their properties and their trees. And so with the recommendations that are brought to you today, we have been striving to achieve a good balance between all of those objectives. Without getting into the details of the findings from our engagement, I wanted to bring a couple highlights, and we'll point again to the report for some more details on what we heard from your community. There's a few themes that did emerge that I wanted to just bring up to everyone's mind as we discuss the recommendations, including the fact that we heard about the importance of this bylaw in helping to reduce tree loss, particularly in the context of development, including larger subdivision development. We've also heard a lot that it was important for this bylaw to help support the village and the forest character of the community, and particularly to protect some of those larger trees. There were a number of concerns heard. Some of the most commons included the concern over the bringing of perhaps red tape or another step in the development process that might slow down development and or impact housing affordability. We also heard about concerns with the capacity for the village to implement and enforce this bylaw, and some worries about the impact of this bylaw on private property rights, particularly for homeowners that live on large, very forested lots. And then I'll mention that we heard also some interest in items such as the tree density or canopy cover target approach, which came from your Advisory Planning Commission. So looking at a tree density as a number of trees per hectare proportional to the lot size. And a number of people also mentioned an interest for incentives, which to some extent can be achieved in the bylaw, and to some other extents might be better suited for other tools, which we do touch upon in the report as well. So without further ado, as I mentioned, there's 2 sections in terms of the recommendations provided in this report. Value-driven recommendations, as I mentioned, are the one that we consider need to be anchored on your community context and values. This includes what we regulate in terms of property type and types of trees, how we regulate it in terms of the restrictions we place on removal and the replacement requirements once trees need to be removed, And then finally, how it is implemented in terms of incentives for retention as well as permit fees. And the administrative and best practices I'll cover towards the end of the presentation are really intended to make sure that your bylaw is functional and efficient to implement. So when it comes to what is regulated, you'll see here that we have a table with 2 columns. The recommendations provided in this report really focus on 2 streams of protection, if you will. One that's focused on applying to larger properties and one that is focused on applying to all properties. So to begin, we are recommending that the tree protection bylaw in Cumberland protects any tree that is greater than 20 centimeter on properties that are greater than 0.5 hectares. So that would be those properties that you see in orange on the map. Essentially, that would make up most of the larger properties that are found outside of your urban core. The way we are recommending that this bylaw applies to those larger properties is to require a permit for tree removals of those trees that are greater than 20 centimeter in diameter, but only once a property falls below a density of 50 trees per hectare. The intent of this recommended approach is essentially to protect your larger properties that are supporting a lot of your canopy cover in a context that allow for very forested properties to continue managing their trees without needing a permit, that is, if they remain above 50 trees per hectare, while ensuring that once a property is starting to remove either a greater number of trees or some trees on a sparsely forested property, you essentially have a clear-cutting prevention mechanism. So on larger properties, you would be applying this bylaw once it falls below a certain tree density. Within all properties, so including those larger properties as well as your urban core, we are recommending that you apply the tree bylaw to 2 different types of trees. One would be those very large diameter tree, which we are recommending that you set at a diameter of 75 centimeter or greater, which would be similar to what you find in Qualicum Beach for a local reference. This would allow the protection of those larger trees that are valued by a number of participants to our engagement. We're trying to find a balance here between protecting a good amount of them while ensuring that both the volume of applications required for review and the number of trees protected under the bylaw for your private property owner reaches a balance. And in addition to those very large diameter trees, we've also recommended a number of native species of importance that would be protected at a height of 0.5 meters. This list is generally consistent with the tree bylaw in Courtenay, as well as updated with some input from your staff. It includes native species that are important to sustain habitat, as well as ones that we expect to take perhaps more space as we evolve with climate change. Now that we have defined how we're recommending what types of properties and trees would be regulated, I wanted to provide, of course, an overview of how we regulate it, both in terms of the restrictions on removals as well as replacement requirements once those trees are removed. So starting again with those larger properties, to remove any trees that are between 20 and 74 centimeters, so those trees that are on those larger properties, once we fall below 50 trees per hectare, property owners would then need to apply for a permit and meet a circumstance for removal that is listed in the bylaw in order to receive a permit to remove trees. So once again, this would apply to trees that are smaller than those very large diameter trees, and only on properties that fall below that tree density target. Similarly, for all properties, when homeowners would be wanting to remove any of those very large trees or those native species of importance, they would similarly need to meet a circumstance that's listed in the bylaw. You'll find the full list of those circumstances in the bylaw. They're fairly typical for tree protection bylaws in British Columbia. They include circumstances such as ensuring that trees can be removed when they're hazardous or an invasive species, when they're causing infrastructure damage, growing too close to a home, or creating additional risks, and also in contexts where their removal is required to build to the applicable zoning. So again, this would be essentially the way in which property owners could apply to get a permit to remove trees, either those very large or those native species, or once they fall below 50 trees per hectare on a larger property. In those cases, we're also recommending that you apply replacement requirements to ensure that canopy is replaced over time. And we are recommending that you require 1 replacement tree for every tree that is removed. And this would be a tree that has the capacity as a species to grow to a large size at maturity to ensure that we get a good replacement of canopy over time. On larger properties, we're recommending that you cap the number of replacement trees once a property reaches 50 trees per hectare, meaning every tree removed would be replaced by a new tree up until we reach that 50 trees per hectare. The balance we're trying to achieve here is making sure that we're replacing and sustaining canopy over time, but avoiding burdening those property owners that have very forested properties that might be removing just a few trees. In terms of how it applies to all properties, we're also recommending that you apply a requirement for significant native species to be replaced by other native species. And then finally, in terms of how it is implemented, in terms of both incentives and permit fees, you'll note that on larger property, we have made a recommendation that those very large diameter trees be counted as multiple trees towards achieving that tree density of 50 trees per hectare. This is intended to be an incentive, which we find in a number of bylaws in British Columbia, to retain those larger trees in the context, particularly of development, as a way to for staff to work creatively with applicants to retain some of those really important canopy trees. On private properties, on other properties other than your large properties, we've recommended that you consider the use of your cash and lieu reserve fund to support some of your community members in maintaining existing trees or planting new trees over time. This is not something per se that would be defined in the bylaw, but rather in the way you use the cash and lieu that is generated for your replacement requirements. And for context, cash and lieu would be paid out once a property owner needs to plant replacement trees but doesn't have space to replant them on the land. And again, is something that we're seeing a lot of communities look into as a way to sustain and support people that are stewarding the urban forest.
Camille, we have a question.
Just have a question here. So, I wasn't quite clear. For this permit fee, is that per property or per tree? Is that it's calculated
That is
on?
per property. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much.
Yes, so essentially we're recommending $100 per property, except $100 per proposed property in the case of subdivision. And the balance here again is trying to be providing a permit fee that would cover some of your implementation costs while being reasonable to the applicants. In case of subdivision, we're proposing that it is proportional to the number of lots because we anticipate that would be somewhat proportional to the amount of time or the complexity of those applications. Great. And then the last bit on recommendations that I'll provide is just on those administrative and best practices recommendations. You'll notice in the report that we've included a number of permit exemption recommendations, allowing for things like the removal of imminently hazardous trees, hedges, or other provincial exemptions to municipal tree regulations. We've also provided a number of recommendations on the permit application requirements, so that specifically relates to qualified professional reports. And this is really primarily intended to allow your staff to obtain the relevant information, particularly in the context of development, to review those more complex applications and make sure they can enforce the requirements of the bylaw. And then a number of protection measures for trees being retained on construction site, which also relates to some recommendations in your urban forest management plan and is really important to ensure we're not seeing damaged trees that are being protected during construction period. And then the last bit I will mention here is focused on planting standards for those replacement trees. We want to make sure that those trees can be as successful in their growth as possible. So this includes recommendations related to the types of species that can be planted and how they can be planted to ensure that they can grow to their full potential over time. And I'll just close this very brief presentation by providing just an overview of some of the anticipated financial implications which were developed with your staff. Based on the recommendations that we're providing to you and a review of permit application and volumes from neighboring municipalities, we would anticipate that you would see with this new bylaw a certain number of inquiries and permit applications per year to process from property owners as well as development-related permits. And that staff time would be required to respond to those inquiries, review and issue permits, as well as carry out bylaw enforcement up to a total of approximately 187 hours of staff time, again, based on assumptions made based on your staff knowledge as well as volumes that we see in neighboring communities and similarities with the recommendations that are made in the report. And with that, I will close it there, and I would be happy to take any further questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Camille. Questions from Council? Councillor Brecky.
Just one of the things that was raised, and this is something I've noticed too, especially in these long periods of drought, I think there might be a measure, and Rob's not going to like this one, but tied into being able to water these large trees if you're going to retain them on your property. Right now you see a lot of the cedar trees around they're really drought stressed right now, and without us having capacity to try and preserve those trees in town, you're just going to end up losing them anyway. So if our goal is with this, we might consider tying it into some sort of exemption or watering schedule as well, where we can try and retain them. Overall, though, I really like the content of this report. Just a curiosity, the dogwood, it seems to be, and this is just a personal beef with dogwood, because you go out in the cut blocks and it's not really a huge canopy tree. Why was that considered in the report?
Yes, through the chair, that's a great question. The list of native species that we decide to protect, there's always many reasons why that is. For dogwood, as well as some of the other trees that you'll see on that list, one of the rationales for that is that some of those species tend to grow to a smaller size at maturity, and therefore they tend to be rarely captured by those other categories of trees, if you will. So, for example, might be unlikely to reach 75 centimeter in diameter and be protected under other categories. So it is an attempt to capture some of those species that are important to the local ecosystem, but that might not reach that larger size, or at least over a much longer period of time in some cases, depending on the species.
Okay, no, thank you. That's a great answer.
Oh, we've got Courtney putting her hand up.
Thank you. I just wanted to let you know that during stage 3 watering restrictions, you can water trees between certain hours, and if watering is done by handheld container or hose equipped with shut-off nozzle.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Next question from Mayor Brown.
Yeah, so following that, I'm just wondering, I agree with most of the things. I have a couple of concerns, but when we talked about introducing this bylaw, we also talked about educating the public on how to retain trees and how to properly water and mulch and make sure your tree is going to live. And so wondering how we're going to engage that education, whether that's part of this initial contract with the bylaw or whether we'll have to develop that separately and have it live on the website somewhere. That's my first question. And then, I think in the current context of extreme weather, we looked at a certain set of species, I think, and I wonder if we should be adapting that species list to be more drought tolerant, so that we're planting the right trees, because maybe we shouldn't be planting cedar. As much as we would like to retain them, if the cedar trees are all dying on Vancouver Island, maybe we don't want to continue to plant them. So just, if anybody wants to speak to that.
Through the chair, I'm happy to speak to some of it, and I might look to staff for some other components. In terms of your last comments there, Mayor Brown, on extreme weather, yes, we certainly would recommend that a species list be at least inclusive of information about drought tolerance. Our team did develop a fairly extensive species list for Metro Vancouver in terms of looking at climate suitability, both present and future, and there's many other resources that could be drawn upon. Certainly, I think one consideration when it comes to things like cedar, which we know is struggling with the drought, it may become less and less suitable over time. It might still be a good species to consider in stream site protection areas, for example, that have access to more site moisture. So it might be about providing information to community members about where certain species might be planted if their range becomes more restricted over time.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I mean, I around town, there are an awful lot of sequoias in people's very small backyards, and they're going to just have to go. They're just an enormous tree. So just making sure people are aware of those things. And then one of my other concerns was there's a recommendation or in the areas where we would allow removal. One of them is in the wildfire interface. And so that's essentially the entire ring of the village. And so I'm concerned about what that means there.
Yes, great question. Through the chair, Mayor Brown, I think that's a really important consideration. What we're seeing in tree bylaws at the moment certainly is, to some extent, we need to make sure your bylaws are aligned with other policies that are in place. And if your wildfire development permit area is going to require, in some instances, that tree removals take place to reduce risk, we wouldn't want to be conflicting with another policy. That being said, there are also many ways to address risk with things like lift pruning. And what the way we like to frame those recommendations, or those provisions in the bylaw rather, would be to require staff to approve the changes that are being recommended to landscaping, so that tree removal can be vetted by staff with appropriate training, and generally also require professional reports, so that you don't get requests that are coming without proper support from a professional, and making sure that those removals are really warranted, and that there is no other alternative that is possible, such as pruning, to reduce the risk. So that's usually the way we try and balance that out, with the recognition that it does tend to lead to some tree removal. So certainly something to consider as well if you are in the process of reviewing the OCP, in terms of making sure that the development permit language can support that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Councillor Tyrion.
Yeah, I guess my comments and concerns are mostly on the financial end of this. We're struggling with our current bylaws. We've just passed a vacation rental that we're not enforcing. How are we going to enforce this? And where are we going to find the staff budget? Because that's not budgeted at this time. All we've budgeted is the actual bylaw itself. So where are we going to find the budget for enforcement?
Yes, the report does include an estimate of what kind of resources may be required for a tree protection bylaw to implement it. And yeah, certainly it does require resources, including bylaw enforcement. And right now we haven't had a bylaw, so we do not know how many applications we might receive. So that is certainly an estimate. So after the first year, we see that we get a lot more. I mean, it's a financial planning question, so it'll come to you as part of the financial planning process, how you might want to fund the bylaw. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I also wanted to maybe take this opportunity to respond to something Mayor Brown asked about incentives. So that was not an education that was not included as part of this contract with Diamond Head Consulting Camille, even though I'm sure she'd be great at that. We'd love to have her. But yeah, so that's would also be a separate budget line item if we want to, apart from sort of just communicating about the new regulations, which is something we do as part of our regular responsibilities when we put new bylaws in place. But if we actually want workshops on how to properly maintain and prune your trees for those people who want to improve tree retention on their properties, that would also be a separate budget line item. Yeah.
So would our money be better spent just on education rather than trying to put in a bylaw that's going to be difficult to enforce?
That's a rhetoric question, maybe, but one of the alternatives in front of council is rather than a bylaw, is spending money on incentives, supporting those people who do wish to retain their trees.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
that is an option, but
I quite like the part of the bylaws where we're going to be the 50 trees per hectare and preventing the clear cutting. I'm also worried that the trying to regulate private property is going to be quite unpopular. We had 90 people respond to this survey, is that right? And 97% of them said tree protection is very important. So it's a very biased group that responded to the survey, and is probably not reflective of the whole population. So when we start saying, no, you can't cut down your trees, I think we're going to run into a lot of problems. we may see a rash of trees being cut down in advance of the bylaw coming out. And it may be counter to what we actually want to happen, because people are worried that they're going to have to go through a big process to do it. So I'm not sure. Can we implement the bylaw in pieces and have it presented to us in parts so that we can like choose what we want out of it? I'm struggling a bit with how we're going to enforce this and how unpopular it may be for some of this.
Yeah, through the chair, it's a council decision, and that's why we're here today, to get your direction. So it's really discussion to have at this meeting. What kind of bylaw do you want put forward in the fall? Certainly, if you choose to, and I think I put some alternative recommendations in there to help you work through the different components of the bylaw. So if you wish, you can go through them one by one, see what you agree to, what you'd like to do, what you would like to put off, or how you might want it to be strict or less strict. So you can break it up just on large properties that are developing properties. That would be there's the larger ones over 0.5 hectares, or the full gamut. You can change the diameter of the tree. So we set it at 75 meters squared. Actually brought 75 meters in diameter. Actually brought a prop. So this happens to be 75 centimeters wide. So at breast height is how it's measured. That's at which is a 4.5 feet height off the ground. That's how it's measured. So it gives you an idea. So we weren't trying to hit every tree. We were trying to hit fairly large, significant trees. So it just gives you an idea.
There's not a lot of
If that
trees
helps.
right within the urban core that are that big
Do we
either.
do we have an idea of how many trees this is in the urban core?
At this point, we do not have that information. So if the complete community grant is received, one of the potential things we can do as a part of the mapping is do some more in-depth mapping on that.
And just one last question about the ticketing. It says if there's a bylaw infraction, we issue a ticket, and then we can enforce that ticket every day. But how does that work? Once a tree's cut, it's cut forever. So are we ticketing them every day until something grows back to the same size? How do we?
Through the chair, I'm happy to take that question. That's a great question. This would be primarily meant for infractions that are leading to damage to trees being retained on construction sites. For example, if you see damage within the protected root zone of a tree that's being kept on a site, those types of fines are really helpful to help correct actions on site before, for example, a tree has been damaged to the extent that that it would require removal. So that's usually the context in which you would apply these types of every day is a continued offense type of statements, if that makes sense.
So what happens then if somebody does take down a large tree on their property? How do we ticket them or enforce this bylaw at that point?
Yes, through the chair. Typically, the way this would be done is certainly you would have some fines that would apply. A lot of communities require that the fines be at least equivalent to the cash in lieu contribution for a replacement tree to make sure that we're at least able to plant an equivalent tree elsewhere. Some communities also decide to require the applicant to apply for a permit and plant some replacement trees as a corrective action. So that is also something that we could consider. And then in the case of trees that are damaged during construction, we usually include some requirements to make sure that we can fund the work of, for example, an arborist to assess whether the tree can be retained and if corrective actions can be taken to ensure that the health of the tree is not going to be compromised. So we would essentially, to answer your question, when a tree is removed, there would be a combination of fines, that we have the adequate amount to plant the tree elsewhere. We could also work in requirements to ensure that a tree is replanted on the same property where the infraction has occurred.
Okay, I can, depending on how much the fine is, I can see a situation where it might just be worth to the person to just pay the fine. Okay, thank you. Just for my perspective here, I'd like to see this bylaw done in pieces, or have it come and we can implement the first part of it, and then as we see how our bylaw enforcement and budget allows, bring on the more heavily administrative, the parts that are going to be harder to administrate at a later time. I agree in principle with most of this. I'm just really worried that we don't have the capacity to do this.
That's fair. Councillor Kettler?
Yeah, I don't share the same concern. I feel pretty comfortable with, we've struggled with having large areas clear cut and the subdivision part, and I think that most of council's clear that they want the tree bylaw to address those larger subdivisions. But
Yes, I agree with that.
yeah, I also feel comfortable about the residential because of the large size of the tree that applies to the smaller lots, and the fact that all the what ifs are included in there. Like, what if it's growing into my foundation? Well, then you're exempt. What if it's the limbs are like a risk to my roof or something? Well, then you're exempt. What if it prevents me from carrying forward whatever I'm allowed to do from a zoning perspective, and that then you're exempt. So there's a lot of room, I think, for individual property owners to move within this bylaw while still protecting trees. And the information that we would get, I think, from the future studies that we're going to be doing, we could tweak it, I think, once we know, how many trees it applies to and all that, which hopefully we'll get that grant and get that information, and then we can tweak the bylaw, I think, from there. Instead of doing it in a phased approach, we can move forward with, I think something that's quite open for those smaller individual lots, and tweak it as we go.
We have Mayor Brown again.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to speak to the bylaw enforcement. I think regardless of whether or not we are able to fully enforce the bylaw immediately, it's important to have this bylaw in place, because bylaws aren't just there to be enforced. I mean, they are there to be enforced, but they're there to set expectations and responsibilities and implementation for developers. And I think that 90% of the population looks at a bylaw and says, okay, I'm going to follow this bylaw because I'm a rule follower. And there's 10% of the population that maybe doesn't want to and won't. And that's where our money gets spent. We don't necessarily need to move into strict enforcement right away, and we can still have the bylaw and be moving towards that. I think it's important to set those expectations for the community. Clearly, given the survey results, although they were small, and I'm also concerned about that, the people who show up, and I will reiterate this over and over and over again, the people who show up for input are the people who get to decide. So if you'd like to have your input, please let council know. That's why we do surveys. That's why we publish all this information. That's why we ask for input over and over again. So it's unfortunate that only 93 people responded, but we had responses on both sides. So people who cared greatly about this issue did respond, and they are able to continue to respond. And we always take that input seriously. I'm in favor of moving the whole bylaw forward.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Brecky?
Yeah, I'd like to move this bylaw forward all at once. I think the benefits of having a increased canopy cover in an urban center are they're well studied. They help reduce, from an energy standpoint, it helps cool a town, especially when we're trending towards much hotter, drier summers. It benefits wildlife. It benefits folks who are trying to keep their energy bill down if they're going through if they're pumping out AC all day. There's just I don't think there's any major downsides, and considering the relatively few number of properties this is going to affect overall within the urban core, and then the laudable achievements we want to go for in new developments. I think I'd just like to see this whole thing go the way it is. If anything, I would have gone with a smaller size than 75 centimeters for retention, because there's not that many trees that are 75 centimeters. They're just not. And, you know, they provide important habitat for birds and wildlife. And I've seen a lot of trees come down here in the time I've been, in the last 15 years. It's we're losing those large trees rather than really retaining them. I think it's important for us to get on this now.
Councillor Kettler?
Yeah, I did actually have a little bit of concern about one of the incentives. So I thought it was great, the incentive that if you retain large trees, your large tree that you've reserved counts for 3 trees in the 50 trees per hectare. That's great. The other incentive for the cash in lieu, where we help community members care for their trees, I see that being a real hornet's nest of decision making on who would qualify for that.
More administration.
Right, more administration that we probably couldn't deal with at this point. I think maybe in the future we could look at a low income category so that we could help people. For example, you know, seniors that have owned their home for a long time have these trees that they you know, need to maintain and need help maintaining, that we could maybe make one of those restrictions on use of those funds a low income bracket. But I think right now we don't have the capacity to do that. So I wouldn't support having a cash in lieu fund that everybody's going to try and access for planting and maintenance.
Anyone else? Oh. Yeah, I agree with parts of everybody. I'm in favor of moving it fully. I think mostly for me, I think just to get the bylaw on the books for the new development is the most important thing. And I think we can work out what happens kind of after, just kind of as some people have mentioned. Definitely concerned about the amount of staff time, but I do feel like once we get this on the books, we'll sort of massage that and see how that works out and what kind of administration we're going to be looking at. I do share the concerns that Councillor Therrien mentions as well about enforcement. We all know the history we have with enforcement and such and our difficulties with that. But I think it's more important to get this tree bylaw on the books that we've been waiting for all these years to protect the trees and then figure out the rest after that. Yes. I see Courtney with her hand. Courtney?
Thank you, through the chair. I just wanted to highlight that we will now, you know, we'll see, you know, which direction council, now that we've seen which direction council probably wants to take the bylaw, we can give a better estimate of the staff resources and then the cost needed to actually implement it. And then you'll see that in the recommended budget for 2024. And we've estimated somewhere between $10,000 and $30,000 a year for the resources just to make this happen.
Right.
I'd like to make the motion that council endorse the approach to tree protection bylaw presented in the tree protection bylaw recommendation report prepared by Diamond Head Consulting.
Second?
All in favor?
Yeah. Okay.
All opposed? No.
See the devil in the details.
Carried. Next, stage 3, water restrictions prepared by Rob Crisfeld, Manager of Operations. Come on down, Rob.
Take my props away.
Hot topics. Literally.
All right, well, good evening, Acting Mayor and Council. So I was on holidays a couple of weeks ago, and we were originally talking about moving to stage 2 water restrictions. When I got back, we had a frank discussion with the CEO, and I think based on based on the snowpack levels this year, as I've noted in my report, you know, we're 70 to 80% of what's normal. We had an early start this year to hotter than drier normal weather, and we're actually seeing about a 50% increase in demand this time of year compared to what we've seen in previous years, which is we really struggled to try and wrap our heads around that. It has, just so you know, it has slowed down significantly this week. I don't know why. Anyways, you know, and then looking forward into August and September and what we saw for a dry fall last year with the unknown of what the long-term forecast looks like, staff is, you know, recommending that council consider moving to stage 3 water restrictions. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I can maybe explain why it's fallen off. Most of us have just given up on our gardens, and that's it. It's too dry. I'm done.
Councillor Kettler?
Yeah, probably because I think the clouds moved in this weekend and maybe took the temperature down a little bit. But I just wanted to say, being on the call last week with 3 ministers, in particular Bowen Ma, the Minister of Emergency Management, and they're asking municipalities to increase water restrictions. They want us to take into account that, of course, snowpack is very low. We won't be getting much rain. Demand in times of extreme heat is much higher. We need to take into account releasing flows for fish and continuing to release those flows for fish into the fall. And so I think, you know, this is a unique situation for the province. They're looking at us all and going, oh, geez, if we all these municipalities suddenly run out of water in late summer, you know, the province is in a pickle to try and help everybody. So so I think it's a good thing to move to a higher level. At the regional district, we also have a similar report coming for tomorrow night, and the Black Creek Oyster Bay water area will be recommending to move that to a higher level water restriction, and the overall Comox Valley water system. We actually don't have the authority to move to the next level. That is based on BC Hydro and their decision on how much flows to release. So that's not actually within our purview to move to the next level. The regional district on Comox Lake is for the first 2 stages, just like the village of Cumberland, where on a certain date it automatically rolls over to those restrictions. So, but to go to that next level is not within the local government's purview for the Comox Lake water system. So, just for everyone's information, but I support us moving to the next level here.
And just so council's aware, I mean, you know, we've drawn heavily from the Cumberland Creek side because of this is the time of year we see like a turnover in Allen Lake, and so we see some of the algae that die off come to the surface before they settle out again. So that's calmed down, and so we're able to draw heavier from that side, but we've drawn down pretty heavy in the Cumberland Creek side. So, you know, we're at levels that we were at levels in August last year, and that's we still have 77% of the volume in Allen Lake, which is, you know, 1.16 million cubic meters. Is quite a volume in that lake, but just so you're aware, we're not in dire straits, but I think we just need to play it cautiously. So,
Thanks, Mayor Brown.
Yeah, on that note, I was also on the call, the provincial call, and I think that's probably why usage has decreased in the last little while. The province is doing a concerted effort on educating people and asking us to have shorter showers, water less, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is timely, and I think in these, given the drought of last fall, unprecedented drought of last fall, we just need to use the precautionary principle at times like this. Then we need to restrict as high as we can, and then we can lighten up if the rain comes. And we're grateful for the rain today, but it's not nearly enough. So yeah, I appreciate the recommendation to go straight to stage 3. Thank you.
I just wanted, I think you've just answered it, but just for the people at home, even if we all adhere to stage 3 water restrictions, have we got enough water to last us till November, even if we don't get another drop of rain?
Well, I think we do because we also have the Coal Creek well, right? So during average day demand type conditions, it typically supplies 30% of our water. So we're actually fortunate that way. A lot of water systems have one source and that's it. So we have the 2 service supplies and the well. We might have to move to further restrictions, but I think, we should be able to make it.
Okay, thank you.
Just pray for rain though.
Yeah, so
Always.
pray for rain, shower with a friend, all the usual things. Yeah, okay.
Who's up? There's a recommendation there, Council.
The council bring into effect Stage 3 water restrictions effective August 3rd, 2023.
Second.
All in favor?
Thanks,
Thank
Rob.
you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks a lot, Rob. Okay, well, next up is the official community plan review, phase 1, public engagement report, prepared by Karen Albert, senior planner. Come on up, Karen.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. So this report is to present you with a summary of phase 1 of our public engagement for the official community plan. I think all of you came to the event actually on the 24th of May, which was really well attended on one of the side streets in the village. And we got a fair amount of input on that during that event. And that was all transcribed, and the appendix to the summary report is a transcription of all the input that we got, organized, and then categorized. So you can see, so the actual wording is what we actually heard and what we actually received, and then it was sorted into themes, and the themes informed the both the vision statements that are in the staff report today, and the goals for the official community plan. So they flow right out of all the input that was received. And so the initial phase really was to get feedback on the big questions, which is the vision, the long-term vision for the village, and then the goals, the key focus areas or key priorities within the OCP, which is not to say that the OCP won't contain everything else that it does today. It just provides a focus, and it flows right out of the vision statements as well. So the aside from the Plan Your Community Street event, all the same activities were posted in an online environment. We got about 73 contributions to that as well, where people could continue, who weren't able to come to the event, could map their favorite places, provide a comment, provide ideas for the vision, and then also respond on the specific topic areas, any topics that came to their mind of concern, and we'll be looking at those for the fall. We'll sort those as well and look at during the fall at exploring some of those in greater detail. So the phase 2 will flow directly from phase 1 input that we received. At this point, the report is really presented for information, but also your reflections on the process, what you're hearing to date. The vision is right now statements, and the Advisory Plan Commission, as the consulting committee on the official community plan review, has reviewed that as well and added some, and we tweaked some things to make sure it fit with what we heard and it makes sense. So those are those are statements that'll be crafted into a cohesive vision as we have now, so they won't be showing up as separate statements. And then the intent is to bring that back to the public as well and receive input on that. Yeah, and the goals flow out of the vision, but also the comments that we've received through the engagement report. So yeah, I'm here for questions and your reflections.
Fantastic. Council, reflections? Councillor Kettler?
I was just happy to see that, that a lot of our goals, our original goals, are still there and, added to. I feel like, you know, all the statements and goals are make me feel like, yeah, this is a place I want to live, and so I think that's a good thing. And I guess, like Mayor Brown was saying in our last item there, that that the people who show up and give input are the people who design the future. So so any people out there that feel like they haven't had a chance yet or weren't part of that process, please give their input. Thank you.
Councilor Brecky?
I just wanted to say I was really happy with the outcomes of this. It sounded like, thinking back to last fall when we were all debating around the table and who's going to get elected and not, this is pretty much encompasses our combined platform. So I think we're well aligned with what the folks in the village who came out and contributed want to see. So thanks, everybody.
Yes. Mayor Brown?
Yeah, I just wanted to check in on the next engagement. I've had a few questions about the next phase of engagement and what that looks like. And I know there's a section in your report, but just wondered if you could speak to that, Karen, so that people are aware of when next they can get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have there's a number of components to the official community plan review. So the next phase of the engagement is to dive into the topic areas. So that it has a number of policy areas, and the feedback we got asked for during this spring was to identify some hot topics. So we'll be looking through what those might be and categorize them according to the topic areas, the larger policy areas. So that's one thing that will happen, and hopefully this fall. Having said that, we are waiting to hear from the Complete Communities grant. If we get that, then maybe we'll be spending a little bit more time on analysis and mapping, which might delay some of the planned engagement, the fall engagement, to a little bit later. But we'll provide you with an update on that when we hear about that grant application. So right now, I've been visiting with the different committees. So that was one of the engagement plan. The engagement plan that was brought forward also included working with the committees through some of the topics within their mandates. So we've had an initial meeting with the Heritage Committee. There'll be a second one with the Housing Committee. The initial data for the Housing Needs Report came to them for some input, and there'll be a follow-up meeting with them. Then also the Advisory Plan Commission, who's kind of the umbrella group for the overall process, meeting with them again. So there's meetings happening right now in the summers to prepare for the fall and identify key topics to discuss with the public, identify some gaps we currently have in the OCP that we might want to include, ensure that's part of that discussion, and then also try and get everything else on board in terms of other consultants. So we are looking at the Climate Action Plan being done through a consultant team. So getting a request for proposals out for the Climate Action Plan. And the big one is growth scenarios. Currently we have mapping, of course, support from the GIS staff with the CVID through contract. So we started working on a build out and scenario. So if we do nothing, what is the capacity still to grow within the village? And then what are the growth scenarios? Where do we want to grow? In what areas of the village and how? So that we're starting on some of that data analysis. And again, if that Complete Communities grant comes through, then we can do some more additional data crunching, which would be great to have. So yeah, we're trying to line up everything for the fall. So, but at the moment, it's a lot of background research and getting the data together and getting another RFP out for consulting.
Great, thanks. Councillor Therrien?
Yeah, thank you. As Jesse said, this does sound like a town I want to live in. I'm happy with a lot of the visions and goals that are here. And I do think that the growth scenarios is going to be a hot topic. I'm going to be speaking to that a little later this evening. And yeah, great work. Glad to see everybody coming out. I hope the engagement continues.
Yeah, thanks. Personally, I thought that was very cool, very transparent, and so many people came out. I like that it informs how diverse we are when I find out that 4 people in this village's favorite place is Soulport Park. So we have a bunch of different kind of folks. I thought it really warmed my heart. So there's something for everyone in this village. And yeah, I'm really happy with the process, and I'm happy that we all came out. And I think that was the best engagement we've had since I've been on council. So way to go, everybody. So look forward to the future of that one. There's a recommendation there for council.
Where is it? As soon as I can find it.
The
coun-
council received the official community plan review phase 1 public engagement report dated July 14th, 2023.
Second.
All in favor?
Huzzah.
Boom. All the way from Vancouver.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thanks, Karen. Next, we have local government climate action program prepared by Andrea Sampson, Manager of Finance and Human Resources. Hello, Andrea.
Hello, good evening. Okay, so this report includes a survey that outlines the village's efforts towards reducing our carbon emissions during 2022 and planned items for 2023 and 2024. So this report is an annual requirement for our LG CAP funding, and over the course of 3 years, the village will receive over about $200,000 in funding from the province. So council has already approved $60,000 to be spent. Sorry, this is like right in my face. On climate action and some continued adoption of the BC Energy Step Code. So both of these initiatives will take place during the OCB update. Initiatives for the remaining funds will come to council as part of the 2024 budgeting process. All the funds do need to be spent by March 31st of 2025. So I'm looking for council approval for posting the completed survey on the village website, and the survey will also be sent to the province once it's approved by council. So please let me know if you have any questions.
Questions, council? Councilor Tyrion?
I noticed on the survey that it shows that we're sticking $70,000 in the bank, and is part of that $70,000 earmarked for the step code and the climate action plan you were just talking about?
Yeah, so through the chair, that's correct. So there's the over $200,000. I think it showed $220,000. So far, $60,000 has been earmarked to spend on the climate action plan and the energy step code, and the remainder has been put into a reserve, which is an allowable use as long as we spend it prior to March 31st, 2025. So.
I wasn't sure if that was an additional 70,000
No, that's part of that.
That's our first
Yes.
tranche, if you will.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Nope.
No? Okay.
Thanks, Andrea. Recommendation, sir?
Oh, there is a motion for that too.
I'd like to move that council direct staff to post on the village website the local government climate action program completed and signed attestation form to confirm all funds were or will be used towards climate action, and a completed PDF version of the required program survey.
Second.
All in favor? Pass. Thank you, Andrea. Next, we have Glamping Sites addition to Cumberland Lake Park Campground, prepared by Ryan Parton, Acting Manager, Parks and Recreation. Come on down, Ryan.
Good evening, everybody. Yes, so the purchase that we're recommending in this report includes the purchase of 5 sleeping barrels for Lake Park and their related amenities. So just a bit of background, in the 2014 Lake Park Master Plan, the addition of a glamping option was identified as a priority for Lake Park, glamping just being an upscale camping option. And then last year when that plan was updated, the glamping option was still included as a priority, just as a way to offset revenue loss from the conversion of the existing lakefront RV sites into some public access green space. So yeah, the plan is 5 sleeping barrels. Each one will have a picnic table and a fire pit alongside the lake, just beyond the western edge of the swimming area. The sleeping barrels would be serviced by a new accessible outhouse. The project would also include some site preparation, trenching to service the barrels with electrical power. Yeah, they're mobile units, so the prep is expected to be minimal. And then everything is going to be done in accordance with, or in conjunction with an environmental consultant, just to make sure they're done in accordance with the village's DPA1 environmentally sensitive area guidelines. Total cost is just over $250,000. That cost is to be borne entirely by Lake Park Society, mostly through grants, and then the remainder through its own resources. Once operational, they are expected to bring in a little bit of extra revenue, between $7,100 and $9,800 to Lake Park Society through the rentals immediately, and then after those RV sites are decommissioned, it's still expected to be an additional $2,000 to $4,500. Now the village's share is 10.5% of that, so it's a lot less. But even when those RV sites are decommissioned, it should still be around like $3,500 or so. Operationally, according to the Lake Park operating agreement, any maintenance that's less than $600 would be handled by Lake Park Society. Anything $600 or more would be covered by the village. It's hard to really put a price tag on or sort of ballpark what that maintenance is going to be. It's largely influenced by things like vandalism, extreme weather, that kind of thing, which are hard to predict. But given that they're new units, we don't expect the maintenance to be super intensive, at least immediately. Yeah, and then long-term, an asset management plan would have to be developed to, eventual replacement of them. So.
Sorry, just to jump in.
Whoa.
I know.
No, that's good timing.
Are you open for questions, Ryan?
I am open for questions.
Councillor
I was reading the space.
Order.
It's just pertaining to that. I mean,
Councillor Brecki, do you have a question?
I do have a question. May I answer? Wow, this mayor is tough. Acting Mayor Sullivan, bringing down the hammer.
It's all an act.
Just what's the lifespan on them? I didn't quite see that on that.
I don't have a hard number on what that lifespan is. I mean, I expect it would be, at least a couple dozen years or so, but I'm not entirely sure.
And just one other question, one follow-up. But any thoughts around just making 4 sleeping cabins and then 1 communal sauna for this?
Okay, that's enough. Thank you, Councillor Kettler.
Thanks. So I have some questions about like the sites they'll be put in, but then some questions about replacement. So the sites, the barrels, are they designed for 2 people? And so basically it's like a couple's campsite that'll be with space for a tent or not, just alone by itself?
Yeah, all the images I've seen look like they would be designed for a couple, like 1 or 2 people. Right. They look fairly cozy, bed, little table, little seating area, and that's about it. I've been talking to Jen, the campground manager, about this. She's been doing the bulk of the research. I didn't get the impression that the plan was to include like adjacent sites for tents as well. Whether that's something they'd allow once they see the site prep, I can't necessarily speak to that.
Okay, thanks. And then generally what we've done with the revenue from the campground is to put it back into maintenance for the campground. But with these new barrels, I was thinking, would we need a specific reserve for replacement of those barrels? So should we be putting part of the revenue into a very specific reserve for those replacement?
Yeah, Michelle would be better suited to answer that than I would.
So yes, we do put the revenue from the campground into it's the general facility reserve, and so all of that is earmarked for the lake park, and we bring it back out for projects. And one of the 2024 to 20 during your budget planning will be to recommend that a portion of that gets kept for the asset replacement, because it will be our asset, and that would be coming towards that would be the recommendation.
Okay, great, thanks.
Anyone else?
Oh.
Mayor
Can I just say one thing?
Yes.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Acting Mayor, tough acting mayor.
Just one.
So I just wanted to say thanks to Ryan and Jen for keeping the ICE-T funding under wraps. But I did speak to Brody, and it's okay for us to plug them a little here. So I just want to do that. The other grantor of 33.5 maybe thousand was Island Coastal Economic Trust, and we are very grateful that they are funding this, and we appreciate them very much. As well as we appreciate the Lake Park for doing all the work to get the money and implementing it all. So thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you very much, Ice-T, and the Lake Park people are doing very good things. I gotta say, I really almost thought that was a picture of the lake already. It's like, what? That's already, like, that looks like what it could look like at our lake for sure.
Yeah, we're very good at what we do.
They snuck the barrels in already? This looks great. Anyway, thank you. Oh, sorry, Councillor Tyrion.
Thanks. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news because I love this idea and it's going to make a lot of money for the Lake Park Society. But if the barrels do only last 25 years, I just did a bit of quick math, and that's going to be $125,000 for us over 25 years, which is not replacement cost on the barrels for us. So we're going to be, like I say, the Lake Park Society is going to make lots of revenue off this, but we as a village are going to be on the hook 25 years down the road for more money than we have received off the barrels, just from some quick math.
So don't quote me on the lifespan of the barrels. I could go back to Jen, and like I said, she's done the bulk of the research into this, and she'll have a better answer for that.
Okay. So we may need to renegotiate somewhat of a different deal once we find out what the lifespan is, but because I'd like to see the village at least recover costs.
Agreed
on this.
Councillor Barecki?
Yeah, just so do they get removed in the wintertime and stored somewhere, or they're down there the whole time?
They'd be down there the whole time.
Forever. So, okay, so there's a potential, well, I would say a strong potential for vandalism in that case. Just given the nature that it's not really patrolled out there in the winter, and these things do happen. Is there any kind of contingency fund that we might have set up, or would that be covered by insurance if there's something over $600? Because if someone goes down, torches 3 out of 5 barrels, we're kind of.
So the barrels would be covered under the village insurance. We did look into the MIABC plan, and no additional cost for that.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
And there is a camp host on site year round.
That's correct, yeah.
Protecting the property.
Oh.
So there is security down there.
Okay.
Keep the squatters out.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll move that council support the purchase and installation of 5 sleeping barrels at Cumberland Lake Park and agree to take said barrels on as village-owned assets, and that council direct staff to include funding for maintenance and eventual replacement of said sleeping barrels as part of the Village of Cumberland's 2024-2028 budget planning process.
Second.
All in favor? Carried.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Next up, we got the CMHC Housing Accelerator Fund application report from the Committee of the Whole.
Is this just
We
went over that quite a bit this afternoon. Do we just need to?
Are we just reading the recommendation?
Are we just reading the recommendation for this?
Okay, this is carried on from our afternoon Committee of the Whole meeting. We got a recommendation.
I see.
See a discussion, go back to that.
Would we like to see a discussion?
No, I was
Oh.
saying to the public, if they
Oh.
want to see the discussion
Yes, thank
around
you.
item 7.6, that to go to our committee of the whole that was recorded earlier today.
And may I just add, the link is in the agenda to that report.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to recommend that council direct staff to submit a Housing Accelerator Fund action plan that includes the initiatives as generally outlined in the staff report dated July 14th, 2023, along with all additional required documentation to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation as the village's application under the Housing Accelerator Fund program. And that council authorize the chief administrative officer to enter into any contribution agreements or amending agreements that may be required should the village be approved for funding under the program.
Second.
All in favor? Carried. Thank you very much. Next is subdivision analysis prepared by Councillor Tyrion.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for hearing me out on this one. This came about. Jen's in the audience. Jen gave me a book called Strong Towns, which I read, and the general premise was that single-family development is bleeding municipalities dry. So I decided to test it locally. We had a new subdivision go in just recently, so I obtained a bunch of data from staff on that subdivision. I made an assumption that the houses would be worth about $950,000 each on each lot out there, and figured out how much taxes that was going to generate for the village. And as you can see, we should be setting aside 62% of the taxes that we receive from that subdivision if we're going to have enough money to replace all of the linear infrastructure as it ages out. So in 60 years, when we need new sewer lines, that's how much money we'd need to be saving to pay for those new sewer lines, just for that subdivision. The remaining 38% is needed to pay for everything else the village does, from water to sewer to replacement to, all of our administration costs, everything else. And of course, this is not the proportion that we spend money at here in the village. It's actually closer to flipped of that. We spend about 60% of our revenues on other things and about 30% on infrastructure. So this leaves us in an unsustainable position. And every new subdivision, single-family subdivision, digs us deeper into the hole. So, yeah, that's where we're at. Okay, I wanted to bring this forward as we're going through our OCP process. I think this should be one of our hot topics, is how do we actually want to grow in the village? Because I think if we continue to grow the way we have been, we are going to be in big trouble down the road. And in fact, we're already seeing infrastructure problems that we can't keep up with here in the village.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Brown?
Thanks. I just wanted to thank Councillor Tyrion for doing this analysis. It was a lot of work. It was a lot of numbers, which she's good at. So I appreciate that. And also Jen for sharing that book with us. I certainly have not made it through the whole thing, but it is very interesting. And I also wanted to say that this is why the province has encouraged us to densify existing neighborhoods. So the province is hoping for up to 4 units per lot rather than single-family dwellings. This is part of the reason, because many communities who are of a certain age most, I would say, communities are facing this infrastructure challenge where they are not generating enough property taxes to deal with infrastructure. Most municipalities generate enough money through property taxes to fund their staff and regular operations, but major infrastructure projects or repairs are just not part of the normal funding of municipalities. The funding for municipalities is, in my opinion, broken, but that's a much bigger conversation and not under the control of this council. What we are in control of is how we zone our community. And so I agree that this is a really important conversation to be included in our OCP analysis. And I also wanted to point out that we did get funding to do a fiscal impact analysis on our new and potential development, including the industrial lands and our other industrial and commercial land. So that will also help us work those numbers for that type of zoning, which will help us considerably in the long run. I also wanted to point out that it is not legal for us to differentiate between taxing residential properties. So you can't say you have a single family dwelling and so you're going to pay twice as much or whatever as the neighbor beside you who has a fourplex. We are unable to do that under the Local Government Act. So we don't have a mechanism for differentiating property tax rates on residential property. All residential property gets taxed the same. Just wanted to add those bits. Thank you.
Yeah, so can I respond to that?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so without having that mechanism, it means the amount of tax we receive is strictly based on the assessed value of the property. And of course, a fourplex will be assessed at a much higher value than a single family home. So we would receive more taxes per, with the same infrastructure costs, right? They take up the same amount of road and water lines, etc. Yep.
Councillor Kettler?
Thanks, and thanks, Councillor Tarian, for the report. I think it's definitely good to bring to the table and talk about, and certainly we've had that discussion about whether we should continue to have single-family zoning at all. And I think that's not just a Cumberland discussion, that's a discussion across Canada. Recently, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities came up with a tool that does just what you've done, basically assessing the value of new subdivisions and the different zoning. You can put different zoning on it and what that does to the return and the cost of infrastructure. So I think that's a valuable tool. I don't know if staff are using that, but it's certainly something that we could.
Tool?
Yeah, that we could be looking at using. But I think, Mayor Brown kind of said it's the model that we've been using for, over a century, right?
All the years.
That you just, it's kind of like this unfettered growth, and you don't really think about the infrastructure, and we see failing infrastructure across Canada. When I was living in Quebec and Montreal, bridges are crumbling, like whole highways, and it's buildings. Somebody was killed by a brick falling off a building when I was there. It's a real problem that we didn't manage our assets properly, and we still have the same model where we're expecting growth to. It keeps us going, but it doesn't address the underlying issues of aging infrastructure. So, and in Cumberland, almost every year I've been on council, the main revenue source is not tax income, it's grants. We rely heavily on grants from upper levels of government. We wouldn't be able to function without it. So it's not a sustainable model.
No. Exactly.
I think it's pretty well known that the denser areas basically subsidize the suburbs. And I agree that we don't want to do that anymore. So I'm definitely into looking at other models and other ways of zoning and growing as a village. Thanks.
Nice. Councillor Brecky?
Stole most of my thunder, what I was going to say. But thank you very much for this. Having worked on both sides of municipal government, you see that it's kind of a shell game, approving these giant things. You only need to look at Mississauga around Toronto and just look at how unsustainable that is. And I think one thing you just brought up about us relying on upper levels of government, once you're going to see large scale communities like Vancouver, like Toronto, like Montreal actually have to deal with their aging infrastructure, and it costs a lot more to dig something up than to put it into fresh ground, that we may be at the back of the line, all these little communities, in favor of having to actually the larger urban centers tackle this problem, and it's coming down the pipe fast. So thank you very much for your analysis here. It's quite sobering.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing the report forward, and I think it's a very important conversation. I'm very happy to have it. So thanks. Upcoming. There's a recommendation.
I'd like to request that council direct staff to include into the scope of the Complete Communities project an analysis of the long-term servicing costs of different development patterns, such as single-family compared to multifamily, and include that information in the OCP review.
Second.
All in favor? Passed. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. No bylaws, no new business, notice, motions, and announcements. Get the Advisory Planning Commission, August 10th, 2023 at 4 p.m. in Council Chambers. The Homelessness and Affordable Housing Committee, August 16th at 9:30 a.m. in Council Chambers. The Board of Variance, August 16 at 11:30 in Council Chambers. Heritage Committee, August 17 at 4 p.m. in Council Chambers. And our next council meeting, regular council meeting, is September 11th, 2023 at 5:30 p.m. But you may watch for special meetings that may be required and will be posted to cumberland.ca with as much notice as possible. Question period. Megan, if you can come to the microphone, please. Yes. Please say your name.
Hi, my name is Megan, and I will work very hard, as always, to frame this as a question. So I'm wondering, actually, and I will make a comment too, which is just that it's a delight to watch you guys in action, and I'm really proud of the type of conversations our village is having right now. I think you guys are doing a great job.
If we could just keep it to questions.
Sorry.
Sorry,
I am wondering if council would consider or has considered a little bit of a pause or some thought integrated into the tree protection bylaw recommendations. I really appreciate the work that's being done as it relates to addressing greenfield development and the loss of trees at a large scale, and why it was really important for this bylaw to come forward. I do think it's coinciding with some other analysis that's critically important related to the type of timber that's growing in our community and fire smart practices. And the tree descriptions that we're talking about in the plus 75 centimeters, we're moving very much into the sequoias that Vicky had mentioned, and also Douglas fir, which are not actually ideal urban trees. And so I found it interesting in the discussion about risk analysis and then imminent danger that we're speaking about things like a tree falling on a house or growing through a power line, but we aren't having really important conversations about what urban forests look like in the context of climate change, not only as it relates to watering, but as it relates to fire risk within the village. And one of the things that has been learned through the wildfires across the province is that fires don't come into communities as a wall of fire from the edge. Fires come into communities through embers, and the biggest wicks that we have in the community are these very large mature Douglas firs. And so I just believe that I should ask if council would consider a little bit of sober thought related to the residential framework for that bylaw in the context of climate and fire smart, which I know Diamond Head is really smart on, but I don't see really well represented in the recommendations currently. Our obsession with big trees is great, and they serve a real function, but it's not only big trees that serve critical functions in urban forest canopy. Those smaller trees are really important. So if we get all preoccupied with saving big trees, we're not addressing other critical climate issues. So I am asking if you might consider that as this continued rollout happens, as I note it as missing, which is a surprise, but I think it just needs to be raised. By the village, which is why I'm bringing it up in a public context, saying get that on the table as you're framing this up for urban lots, because I'm concerned it's missing.
Good. Absolutely. I see Mayor Brown stand up there.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we, that was the point I was trying to make with the type of trees we're asking people to not take out and the type of trees we're asking to plant. And so I think the consultant got that message, and I wonder if Courtney's still in the room, if maybe we can address that through the development of the bylaw through staff.
Courtney
Is
is
this
still in the room.
Yeah.
Courtney, if you could reply, please.
Yes, through the chair. Yes, we will have a closer look at that the species list for both the removal and replanting, and when that comes back to council for the bylaw.
Okay, thank you very much. Councilor Berkey.
I think, while that's incredibly accurate, and you know, my house is surrounded by giant Doug firs there, and it is a fire risk. The number of large trees over 75 centimeters is actually quite small within the village here. There's not a lot of them. They are giant wicks. Don't get me wrong. I'd probably be out there at the chainsaw if the forest fire is coming towards us. But I just don't currently see it as being a huge threat to the overall number of properties here.
Through the chair, may I clarify?
Yes.
Just saying that there are other really valuable deciduous species that could also be captured within protection, and when we zero in on that plus 75, we're only capturing
This is
species
true.
selection. That's what I'm getting at.
And I think we could actually capture probably more suitable species if we drop that number. So, you know, if we do plus 75, the majority of those are big Doug firs. I don't think there's any Sitka here left, but I think you're right. It overrepresents large Douglas firs and the redwoods as well. They just are. Those are the big trees, and were we to try and capture something that might be a little more suitable to our evolving landscape here, Gary Oaks are an excellent candidate, and they don't. There's not. It takes a long time for a Gary Oak to grow to 75. So if there was some tweaking in there, it would be maybe to look at those different species and look at them in a different context than just being big. You're absolutely right. Okay, thank you. No, that's excellent.
Megan is not saying to cut down all the large trees in the urban forest.
Hey, Councilor Tyrion.
Paul, start it.
Would it be useful then to have a size by species then where each species has its own size limit
Sounds
as
very
opposed to
reasonable.
just a blanket 75?
Well, I think so. I think the regulation, as it's outlined in the report, actually isn't just the over 75 centimeters. It's also the other list of species we want to try and protect. So I think it's covered in there. I don't necessarily think we want limits or size. I think we just want to protect all those trees as best we can.
But what about like large cottonwoods, which are also
Well,
a huge tree cover canopy, but they rarely grow over.
Probably causing damage to the property and be removed for that reason, unless they're in wetland.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions online?
Yes, we do.
Fantastic. And sorry, so staff, I saw you typing furiously. You guys took that all in. Okay, thanks. Moving on.
Okay. First email on the tree bylaw. In cases of a dispute, how can it be determined who is responsible for obtaining a permit for tree removal, and if trees are to be replaced, where are the new trees to be planted? And this relates that in some older lots in the core, there may not have accurate locations for property lines, and some properties have rows of older trees planted around the perimeter of the lots. So I think it's determining who the property owner is of that tree if it borders a property line.
We have Karen coming up.
Yeah, and I have the question here since there's more than one. My memory is not that great. So, in case of a dispute, how can be determined who is responsible for obtaining a permit for tree removal? So, I assume that the person may not have read. Well, there was no bylaw to present yet, so the bylaw would set out the parameters of when a tree can be, when you can, under what circumstances a permit is required, and in what circumstances it would have to be removed. In case of a dispute, I can only assume that might be is if there was a dispute between the homeowner and the staff determining that a permit is required, it's usually up to staff to interpret the bylaws. So that, but if they don't agree with staff, they can raise it up the ladder. So that would be one of the answers. And then the next one was if trees are to be replaced, where are the new trees to be planted? So again, the bylaw would set out some parameters for where you can plant within your property, obviously avoiding on top of sewer lines. There might be setbacks that are required if you plant them against to a building, for example, so you don't have to take them out again the next years or a few years down the road. But apart from those parameters, I mean, that would be the choice of the homeowner on their property where they plant the replacement. And then also says, understand that older lots in the core may not have accurate locations for property lines, and some properties have rows of older trees planted around the perimeter of the lot. So I think there's kind of two questions in that. So whether you there was a tree protection bylaw or not, if you wanted to cut a tree down, you have to make sure that's on your property. And under a tree bylaw, you can't cut down trees in a public right-of-way, for example. That would be up to the village to determine. If a tree bylaw is in place, there would be additional regulations for whether you can cut or not, or what the conditions are. And then rows of older trees planted around the perimeter of the lot. So there's a suggested exemption in the bylaw for a reduction of the replacement, because there are some hedges that were planted, large trees that are planted as hedges. So if you had to replace every single one of those on your property when you take it out, that's difficult. So for hedged trees, the replacement ratio would be somewhat different. So then last one is is Cumberland losing tree canopy, and can the village instead focus on the tree cover lost to new development, which to me seems more drastic. So are we losing tree canopy? It fluctuates somewhat. So I mean, as we expand outward, we are losing tree canopy because the tree canopy over the urban developed area was lower than over the entire administrative boundary of the village. Of course, if there's logging, that will change that canopy cover as well, but that's not something the village has responsibility over, regulating logging. And then the proposed bylaw there's a lot of emphasis on retaining some tree cover for greenfield development, for new development. So that is definitely, I think, really the big focus of the bylaw. So that's hopefully addressing this person's concern.
Thank you very much. More questions?
Yes, there are more questions. How do you water huge maples, cedars, dogwood, and western white pine by hand?
Anyone?
Can I suggest using a hose with a shut-off valve?
Yes.
I believe that is allowed in the
Soaker
regular.
hose would also work.
Sorry, Mayor Brown?
So a soaker hose.
Soaker hose or a hose with a shut-off valve? Yes.
Okay.
Next question.
Next question. Regarding the sleeping barrels, doesn't the CVRD have to approve an outhouse?
I can try to help with that. So any approvals or anything that's required, the Lake Park Society always deal, like if they were to do that, or if we're the ones doing the project, we would look into all of that. I'm not 100% sure, but if the report, I don't think it did address that, but it will be dealt with by staff or by the Lake Park Society when they're doing it.
Excellent. Thank you.
No more questions by email.
No more email questions. Well, that's it. We will move into closed portion.
Okay, I will move that council close the meeting to the public pursuant to section 90 of the community charter to consider the consideration of information received and held in confidence relating to negotiations between the municipality and a provincial government or the federal government or both, or between a provincial government or the federal government or both and a third party, as well as labor relations and other employee relations.
Second.
All in favor? So moved. Thank you very much.